When the war ended and Japan lay devastated, the question of what to do with the emperor was never just about justice. It was about control, stability, and what came next. From the outside, it might seem obvious that Emperor Hirohito should have stood trial like other leaders of defeated Axis powers. Japan had fought an aggressive war, committed atrocities across Asia, and suffered a catastrophic defeat. But for the Allied planners on the ground, especially the Americans, the emperor was not viewed primarily as a man to be judged. He was seen as a mechanism, something that could either hold Japan together or cause it to completely unravel. To understand this, you have to understand how deeply the emperor was woven into Japanese society. For decades, the emperor was not just a political figure. He was considered divine, a living symbol of the nation itself. Loyalty to him was taught from childhood, reinforced in schools, and embedded in military culture. Soldiers didn't just fight for Japan, they fought for the emperor. Civilians endured bombings, hunger, and loss believing they were serving him. Removing that figure abruptly, especially through execution, risked shattering the psychological framework holding the country together. American occupation planners feared that putting the emperor on trial would provoke mass unrest, resistance, or even guerrilla warfare. Japan had millions of armed, indoctrinated soldiers returning home, and a population traumatized by defeat and atomic destruction. The Allies needed calm, compliance, and cooperation to demilitarize the country and rebuild it. The emperor, alive and compliant, could issue orders asking the population to accept occupation, surrender weapons, and follow new laws. Dead or disgraced, he could become a martyr instead, fueling resentment and rebellion. There was also the practical reality of governance. Japan's administrative systems were still functioning, but they relied heavily on the legitimacy of the throne. Keeping the emperor in place allowed the Allies to work through existing structures rather than dismantle everything at once. In effect, Hirohito became a bridge between the old Japan and the new one the occupation forces wanted to create. He could legitimize sweeping reforms simply by endorsing them, something no foreign general could do on his own. This is why responsibility for the war was carefully redirected. Military leaders, generals, and cabinet members were positioned as the true decision-makers, while the emperor was presented as a figurehead who had been misled or constrained by his advisors. Whether or not this fully reflected reality mattered less than the outcome it produced. By separating the emperor from the crimes of the war, the Allies preserved his usefulness as a stabilizing force while still pursuing trials that signaled accountability. Hirohito himself played the role expected of him. He cooperated fully with occupation authorities, renounced his divinity, and publicly embraced a new image as a human monarch rather than a god emperor. This transformation was crucial. It allowed the Allies to argue that Japan was not being humiliated or erased, but reformed. The emperor's survival became symbolic of continuity rather than conquest, making it easier for the Japanese public to accept radical changes without feeling their entire identity had been destroyed. In that sense, the decision not to execute the emperor was less about mercy and more about calculation. He was too valuable to remove. Executing him might have satisfied a desire for moral clarity, but it threatened chaos at a moment when order was essential. By keeping him alive, the Allies gained a powerful tool to pacify, reorganize, and reshape Japan without fighting another war inside a defeated nation. And that choice set the tone for everything that followed. The emperor was not spared because he was innocent, nor because his role was insignificant, but because in the aftermath of total war, he was seen as the key to preventing Japan from collapsing inward. Justice, in this case, was deliberately balanced against stability, and stability won. Behind the decision to spare the emperor was a very specific man with very specific beliefs about power and occupation. General Douglas MacArthur didn't see Japan as a country that needed to be punished into submission. He saw it as a country that needed to be guided, reshaped, and stabilized as quickly as possible. From the moment he arrived, MacArthur made it clear that the emperor would not be treated like a defeated criminal dragged into court. Instead, Hirohito would become an instrument of reform under American supervision. MacArthur believed that Japan's surrender itself proved the emperor's value. When Hirohito addressed the nation and told his people to lay down their arms, the war ended almost instantly. There was no nationwide insurgency, no mass refusal to comply, no drawn-out occupation war. To MacArthur, this was evidence that the emperor's authority was real and immensely useful. If that same voice could be used to encourage demilitarization, democratic reforms, and cooperation with occupation forces, then executing him would be strategically irrational. This thinking shaped everything that followed. MacArthur personally blocked any serious attempt to indict Hirohito at the Tokyo war crimes trials. Responsibility was deliberately shifted downward, toward generals, ministers, and bureaucrats who could be sacrificed without destabilizing the entire nation. Figures like Hideki Tojo became the public face of Japan's wartime guilt, absorbing blame that might otherwise have led directly to the throne. This wasn't accidental or subtle. It was a coordinated effort to protect the emperor's position while still projecting an image of justice. To make this narrative work, the emperor's wartime role had to be carefully reframed. Rather than a commander with real authority, he was portrayed as a constitutional monarch trapped by aggressive militarists. Whether this portrayal was fully accurate mattered less than whether it was believable enough to the Japanese public and acceptable to the international community. MacArthur understood that trials were not just legal events but political theater. And in this theater, Hirohito could not be cast as the villain. MacArthur also controlled access to the emperor in a way that reinforced this image. Their first meeting was famously staged to send a message. MacArthur standing relaxed and dominant, Hirohito appearing small and subdued. The photograph was widely circulated, signaling that the emperor was now under American authority, not above it. Yet he remained on the throne. A living symbol that Japan still existed as a nation, not just an occupied territory. This balance was crucial. MacArthur wanted reform without humiliation. He pushed sweeping changes. Land reform, a new constitution, women's suffrage, the dismantling of the military. But he wanted them accepted, not resisted. The emperor's cooperation gave these reforms legitimacy. When Hirohito endorsed the new constitution and renounced his divine status, it wasn't just symbolic. It told the population that change was not betrayal, but duty. There was also a personal dimension to MacArthur's decision-making. He believed that executing the emperor would place the occupation forces in constant danger, forcing them to rule through repression rather than consent. That would require more troops, more force, and more time. MacArthur wanted results, not endless control. By shielding Hirohito, he reduced the need for violence and accelerated Japan's transformation into a compliant, cooperative state. Critics have argued that this choice compromised justice, and that may be true. But from MacArthur's perspective, justice without stability was meaningless. His priority was to ensure Japan never returned to militarism and never became a hostile power again. In his calculation, the emperor was the single most effective tool to achieve that outcome. So when people ask why the emperor was not executed, the answer lies less in legal arguments and more in strategic vision. MacArthur didn't spare Hirohito out of sympathy or ignorance. He spared him because, in the aftermath of total war, he believed control mattered more than punishment. And the emperor was the key to controlling Japan's future. By the time Japan surrendered, the world was already shifting into a new conflict, one that would come to be known as the Cold War. The Allies weren't just thinking about punishing Japan for its wartime aggression. They were thinking about the balance of power in Asia and the broader global struggle with the Soviet Union. In this context, sparing the emperor made strategic sense far beyond domestic stability. It became a critical tool in securing Japan as a future ally in the growing ideological battle with communism. The United States recognized that the post-war order depended not only on rebuilding Japan, but on shaping it into a stable, capitalist-friendly nation that could resist Soviet influence. Executing Hirohito could have undone all of that before it even began. Japan was exhausted, traumatized, and deeply loyal to the emperor. In a society structured around hierarchical obedience and reverence for the throne, the sudden removal of Hirohito would have left a vacuum that could have been filled by radicalized factions, militarists who had survived the war, or even emerging leftist or communist groups could have exploited that uncertainty to seize power. The American planners understood that a discredited or executed emperor might have triggered violent uprisings, mass protests, or even guerrilla resistance against the occupation. The Japanese people's obedience was not just a cultural trait. It was a lever the United States could use to enforce reforms and ensure cooperation. By preserving the emperor, the Allies kept that lever firmly in place. This calculus was only intensified by the emerging geopolitical rivalry with the Soviet Union. By 1945, it was clear that Europe was not the only theater where post-war influence would be contested. Asia, and particularly Japan, would become a front line in the struggle for ideology and resources. The United States needed Japan stable, secure, and firmly within its sphere of influence. The emperor's survival was a guarantee that Japan would not descend into chaos, leaving room for communist expansion in the region. MacArthur and other occupation planners saw Hirohito as a figure whose existence could discourage radicalization and encourage alignment with Western policies. By keeping him alive, they effectively used a centuries-old monarchy as a shield against the new threat of Soviet-aligned ideology. The emperor also became a tool to legitimize sweeping reforms that might have otherwise been rejected. Japan's new constitution, the demilitarization of society, and the democratization of political institutions were all easier to implement because they carried the emperor's implicit approval. Even though Hirohito had once symbolized militaristic expansion, his endorsement of the reforms reassured the population that these changes were part of Japan's natural evolution, not imposed foreign rule. This reassurance was essential. Without it, Reconstruction could have stalled, undermining both domestic stability and the United States' strategic goals in the Pacific. The decision to spare the emperor also reflected a broader understanding that occupation and rebuilding are long-term endeavors. Punishment might satisfy immediate moral impulses, but it does little to secure lasting peace or alliances. The Americans were thinking decades ahead. They knew that a stable, cooperative Japan could become an economic powerhouse, a regional counterweight to the Soviet Union, and a reliable partner in trade and security. Executing the emperor, no matter how just it might have seemed on paper, would have jeopardized all of these outcomes. Ultimately, the survival of Hirohito was not just about politics or morality. It was about foresight. The decision reflected a nuanced understanding that post-war reconstruction, ideological alignment, and long-term stability often outweigh immediate retribution. The emperor became a symbol not of impunity, but of calculated strategy, showing that in the complex chessboard of post-war Asia, survival could serve a purpose far greater than personal safety or justice. By keeping Hirohito on the throne, the United States secured not just a nation recovering from defeat, but an essential ally in the looming struggle for global influence, ensuring that Japan would become a cornerstone of the Western Bloc in the years to come. This careful balance between stability, ideology, and reconstruction ultimately explains why Hirohito was spared. It wasn't compassion or ignorance that decided his fate. It was the urgent need for a stable Japan capable of resisting communist influence and serving as a foundation for a peaceful, prosperous post-war Asia. In sparing the emperor, the Allies made a strategic choice that reshaped the region for decades to come.